Lambda and Ruby. Let's see if I can get this started. So I like to start all my talks off, especially ones that I haven't baked for a while or given before, with, wait a minute. Let's see if this works. Right? Like, how's that going to look? Well, you know what I could do? I could hit the right arrow key. With this slide. So I haven't practiced this talk. I was literally throwing slides together last night and this morning and stuff like that. I put a lot of my work in how to get Ruby and Lambda and Rails and Lambda stuff done so that I can tell you that it's possible, so that I feel like these slides can speak to. But this is from a game called Portal. I don't know if you've ever played it, but I think every engineer should play Portal because it comes with no directions. You really just have to figure out how you go, which is literally how I got my job, right? Like, I was never a programmer at one point in time until recently, and I became a programmer, and every day I'm still figuring out what the fuck to do, right? Like, and Portal is that game, and Cave Johnson was one of the narrators, I think, one of the main scientists in it. But I'm not doing science, but you're helping me make this talk better because I certainly want to give it again and tell more people about it because I truly believe that Lambda, and especially paired with certain technologies like Ruby and whatnot, are a game changer. So a little bit about me. I do work at Custom Ink. I'm a staff engineer on the e-commerce side. I think everywhere on the internet, Metaskills is me. Maybe not PlayStation. I don't know that Metaskills. He bugs the hell out of me. But on everywhere else, I'm Metaskills. And I won't buy a PlayStation because somebody named Metaskills is already on there. But Xbox and other stuff like that, that's the moniker I typically go by, Twitter, etc. I spent maybe the past year working at AWS Lambda. Mostly within Node.js and building and learning how to, what Lambda is, how to work with it, how to go into the cloud and stuff like that. In fact, recently I just became AWS certified through fabulous course training by a company called A Cloud Guru. And if you have not heard about this or anything, let me give you a little story. So I'm the type of person where I don't like classical education. My parents sent me to, I think, some 70s Montessori school that didn't have grades. I got gold stars and pine cones, and I don't know what structured learning is, and I really am not a fan of structured learning. So I'm going to tell you, though, that I do think getting AWS certified is important only to introduce you to the breadth of the cloud and what AWS has to offer. I firmly believe that we as engineers will be programming the cloud more and more as time goes on, and learning all the different intricacies of the AWS services, how to connect them together, when they're appropriate to use, when they're not, how to use them in sort of very niche at scale circumstances is a really important knowledge. So if there's any one thing y'all can take away today, it's just that learn AWS, dive head in, and I think it's going to be an incredibly valuable resource. I'm certainly retooling my career around it, and I've found it highly rewarding. Oh yeah, so a little fun fact. They tell you when you get the certification how you're supposed to treat the logo and stuff like this, but they didn't tell me I couldn't make this, right? Which is what, the sheriff of Lambda. So that was my most important slide. I enjoyed making that. So let me give you a little intro about how I'd like to, what to cover today. So I think this presentation is split up into 3 different sections. Basically sort of a tech introduction if you're new to Lambda, what it is, how it works and stuff like that. And then I'd like to tell you a few stories about what I did to get Ruby and Lambda, my experiences with that, and then Rails. I think, I don't see my notes, but I did want to say yeah. So I'll do a little survey here though. How many people have used Lambda before? Right, with Ruby? Or have you used SAM? Jets.
And then the new, the thing that was released a couple months ago for the called layers.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
that just came out.
I'll talk a little bit about SAM and what SAM is and why I preferred it over sort of the serverless. You may see serverless.com, which is a technology stack that helps you sort of be cloud agnostic and say you could write your service in theory, you can put it to Azure or AWS or et cetera like that. But I have firmly tied my star to SAM, and I'll sort of explain a little bit what that is and what it is and why. So the reason I'd like to cover this ground, the basic introduction of what these technologies are, is because I myself have always been frustrated. When you go read an article, you're like, hey, you can use AWS Lambda, and here's the hello world thing. Great, you're good, right? You're going to move on from here. And I find that really frustrating because I sort of value a lot of the things that we use at work that have certain structure around them, like how when you check out a new project, when you can get it bootstrapped and set up and stuff like that. And hello world doesn't cut it. I want to hear real stories about what people are using it for and stuff like that. So the aim of this talk and these projects that I've created, my hope is that they would give you sort of like this next level into like, I want to hit the ground running. I want to use AWS and Ruby and get something done and just go from that point on. I want to do what I want to do. And I really want to say that that's going to be what it's going to be for you, right? Like you may want to work on Lambda for a project for your company that you're at now. You may want to do something on Lambda with Ruby for some civic hacking or some Ruby for good or something like that. Whatever it is, I want you to feel like you can start that off, start your problem solving, address the business at hand or whatever the thing that you need to do rather than worrying about tooling and how to set up, right? We've all been to maybe Rails boot camps where like 2 days is spent just getting Ruby installed on somebody's computer, right? Like that's the worst. And that's what I'm hoping to give everybody a leg up on this stuff, is really just a good starting point for where you can pick up Lambda, you can pick up Ruby with Lambda and sort of hit the ground running. And that's it, right? Like what you do with it is your own thing, right? But I do believe that Lambda is sort of a game changer, right? Like Chris, my coworker, has told me this, like he's like, Lambda's just a game changer. I'm like, I don't know if it's a game changer, but I'm slowly sort of adopting like the anti-EC2. I don't think anything should be on EC2 anymore. Like Lambda's not, I haven't really bought into microservices should be everything, right? But I definitely think that the ability to take your code, right, and ship it off and get it running in production. It used to be back in the day when I did this, I would do it on Heroku, right? And it was just like, oh my God, I can just get my app up on Heroku. I can do a few configs. I can set how many dynos I needed, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it just felt great to get my product or my idea out there into the world. And I think Lambda is sort of the next iteration of that. Also, if anybody has any questions, like you can stop and raise your hand or something like that. I have no problem like talking about things or doing things ad hoc. So, okay, right here. So, one of the cool things is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the technical stuff, but I don't want y'all to focus or like say you have to take notes or anything like that. I've got some repositories and some code that y'all can go check out after this stuff and actually read through it. And you'll find way more useful stuff than I'm up here talking about today. A lot more nuance in how things worked and how I did Lambda and Ruby and stuff like that. So this is one of those projects. And the thing I wanted to point out about this project is that I went through PRs. So every major change I did to the code base, I sort of documented in PRs. And this was my story of how I learned how to use Ruby and Lambda together. I'm going to do a story later on about how to use Rails and Lambda, but I'm actually turning them into blog articles for the Customing Tech blog. So I'm thinking about maybe doing a series of about 4 or 5, and each one will sort of be a deep dive of the next step, right? So like I'll cover things like here's the initial getting Rails on Lambda running. I might do articles about like how I do the asset pipeline or other things like databases and stuff like that, but I'm going to sort of split them out into blog articles, and they will be coming soon. And then like, you know, I'm in touch, right? So I live in the Portsmouth, Virginia area, which is right next to Norfolk, but I'm on DC Tech Slack. If you ever felt like jumping in, yeah, you're in our 757 Dev Slack. We have a really good Slack community in the Hampton Roads area, so feel free to find me on DC Tech R757, or frankly, you can email me if you have any questions. But you know, I'm going to share the blog articles and the repos as sort of time goes on after this talk. And you know, programming is sort of a team sport. So let's get into the fun stuff. So tech intro. We talked about Strap. I got sort of like a show of hands of how many people are using AWS. One thing that you'll find in each one of these repos that we're doing is a system called Strap. And I don't know if anybody's used this before, but basically it's a set of shell scripts or bin scripts in your project's directory that sort of convention things, right? So like there's a bin bootstrap that no matter what the language is or what the project is, if you just run bin bootstrap, it will, more than times, like if you're running a Mac, it will set up your development environment. You don't have to think about it, right? There are some things that we sort of build on at Custom Inc. We use this as well. Like we have another bootstrap project that makes sure that we have a node environment or RB environment or other things like that installed on machines so that each project can sort of build on that bootstrap story. So typically, if you were checking on a new repo, there would be sort of bin bootstrap, bin setup, and you'd be great, and you could run bin test. And that's really the only thing you need to know is when you move from project to project that these strap commands are standard. And usually the scripts are written in bash and stuff. So if you check these repos out and you look at them, there's a lot of emphasis put on these little wrapper scripts in the bin directory for doing things. So let's talk about Lambda. So if you've never written a Lambda function, it is literally one method. That's it. I mean, literally one method. And all you have to do in your method or your function, if it's for Node, is return a status code, the headers, in case like, sort of assuming here that your Lambda responds to HTTP requests, but Lambdas can respond to any event, and basically a body. But literally, you're dealing with just one method or one function, and that's why they call it function as a service. And everything you do in this one method is really up to you. It all comes down to one method. I mean, right, that's it. That's Lambda. It's really that easy. SAM. So if you've ever done work and looked at things like serverless, right? Serverless will look a little bit like SAM. You can approach it the same, but SAM is basically two parts. It's a command line utility authored in Python that you install on your computer, and AWS gives you instructions for how to do that, or if you've got certain things installed and you run these projects in Bootstrap, it will install SAM for you. And the other side of it is this template.yaml, which is basically, it's equivalent of it's basically a CloudFormation template, but this expresses your function or your infrastructure as code that you want to deploy inside of AWS. So this is a really sort of small, concise version. You can see here at the top that this AWS template format version, it's some string, and that basically lets AWS knows that when they evaluate this template, they're going to transform it to serverless, and they're basically going to output like CloudFormation at the end of it. But everything in this file expresses your intent for your Lambda function or any other resources it may talk to, databases, S3 buckets, you name it, when you deploy this stuff. And it's, so you basically got a file, you got a command line tool for SAM, and then there's the code you write. But SAM is really the local runtime environment that allows you to simulate the Lambda environment locally. And it's really great. Like you can spin up, I think I have some slides here. I'm sorry I don't see the next slide on my screen. Right, okay, I'll get to that. But like, one of the things that I found out about when I'm learning SAM is that you're actually learning CloudFormation. And CloudFormation is basically, I would have never believed this back in the day if you told me that the entire internet was going to be able to build by a YAML file, right? But CloudFormation is a YAML file that will express anything that you need in AWS set up in AWS. If you needed an EC2 instance, if you needed like a database or anything like that, you can express that infrastructure in a CloudFormation template. And when you deploy that CloudFormation template, you create what's called a stack. And that stack will go through all the work to provision all the stuff that you just asked it to do. So like when I was first learning, it's funny, like I've been a programmer for a long time, but I've never really spun up EC2 instances or cloud native resources. And when I first got into this work about a year ago, I thought for sure I was going to write a whole bunch of bash scripts to call out to the API services to create things for me, right? And I was like, okay, well, if I create an Aurora database, like the first thing I have to create is a parameter group that says I need like certain like InnoDB file formats and stuff, and that may take 10 minutes, and then I might have to put a sleep command and stuff like that. The great thing about CloudFormation is it's sort of this declarative end-of-the-road syntax. You tell AWS what you want to do, and as it consumes that file and creates your resources for you, it'll figure out the order that things need to be created in, and it will do all this work for you. Has anybody used CloudFormation before? I know you said you were doing some stuff. Like this is the power language of using AWS. And it's intimidating when all you want to do is write a function and you're moving past hello world to go like, oh my God, I need to put stuff in a bucket, and learning the syntax to put in this CloudFormation template. But thankfully, this page here, this is the direct link, and I'll share these slides afterwards. But if you were to go to the github.com AWS Labs serverless application model, which is what SAM stands for, there would be a small link that was very important under the auspices of just 2016 spec. And that's what I'm linking to here, and that's all the good stuff. And it's basically syntactic sugar for CloudFormation on how to get your Lambda function out, right? So AWS realized that sort of CloudFormation is verbose, and it's sort of a little daunting when you're coming at new, so they came up with the serverless application model, and it's basically makes syntactic sugar for CloudFormation to get a function out. So they made it a little bit easier, and that's really all SAM is combined with a command line interface. But if you need to go back in and reference, because it is CloudFormation after all, to learn the language of CloudFormation, I recommend this link along with some of the AWS learnings to, like, if you're saying, hey, I want to create a an S3 bucket or a DynamoDB table, well, they actually make it easy to create a DynamoDB table. But if you want to do something a little bit off the range, go read the spec, and that will tell you how you can add things to your CloudFormation file and get it done. So some of the things that SAM offers, they allow a command. So SAM local start API will basically start like it's like Rails server. It'll start a local development server. It'll spin up a Docker instance that shares the same working directory as your project, and you can basically do like you were doing like Rails server. You can change your code, hit refresh in your browser. In this case, most of my work with Lambda is through browser stuff. I've not really used it for Kinesis streams or anything like that, but just know that they offer an interface where you can do SAM local, and you can send it events that simulate events coming from S3 and other stuff like that. So it doesn't just do local HTTP development servers. There's a feature that I use a lot that's called SAM build that does use container. So if your project, whether it be Node or Ruby, uses native extensions for gems or packages, it will build these extensions for you on the Linux platform that is the exact same platform that Lambda is running under. So you sort of you can run locally. You can use your Mac or Windows machine, but if you needed to build and ship the code off, this is what you would be using a SAM build. And they also have a SAM package and a SAM deploy, which takes many arguments after that. But basically, package will take everything in your root project directory, zip it up into an archive, put it into an S3 bucket, and the deploy will take the finished off CloudFormation file and send it up to AWS through a command line interface and tell AWS to start getting working on building your awesome stuff. So that was like a whirlwind tour. If you've never done SAM or AWS before, that can sort of be daunting. But again, like if you go to that repo that I shared with 757 our Ruby group, you can kind of hit the ground running and sort of not worry about all that stuff. So let's talk about Ruby and Lambda. So I've been working with Node for about a year. And I'm mainly a Ruby person, but I've done large JavaScript apps or single page apps, and I've really enjoyed working with Node over the past year. I love Ruby, but it might not be the right choice all the time, right? So like if you're doing some stuff where like we're doing some image processing, and there's a Node bindings to I think it's called I forget about it. It's a really badass, what's it called? libvips. And it's a badass image processing library. And the Ruby bindings are just not up to snuff. So I'm having a really good time using Node for it. And Node 8 has async await patterns, so it's tenable to deal with it. But I do think Ruby is a good option. But when I'm dealing with projects, whether it's Node or Ruby, there are certain things that I want my project to do. The main is that I want local development feedback. That's why SAM server was really important for me. If you used to adopt serverless framework, you kind of have to install plugins to get local development to work. And I'm very tactile in my development cycle. I will do everything in IRB before I write a test, or I'm a very I write a lot of code, but I'll still use get Google searches, and I really require touching things and changing things and getting immediate feedback to know if I'm on the right path or not. So local development feedback rapidly is one of my sort of pillars of development cycle. Another is being able to, whenever you cook a project up, like Hello World works, but as soon as you start packaging native extensions like libvips, and you need that compiled for Linux, or if you're using a Ruby gem like Nokigiri for XML processing, and then it has to be on your Mac it's compiled one way, but on another it's compiled another way, the process has to serve both. And the last that I wanted to do with the particular project for Ruby is I wanted to use something that was a database, and of course I chose DynamoDB for that. Has anybody used Dynamo? Okay, so think of it, it's like a NoSQL database, but it's not really, I guess it is NoSQL. I've shied away from it in the past, but I think there was a story, Chris, you told us this, like basically AWS is running off of DynamoDB. So you can't really go, oh, well, this is like the Mongo of the future, right? If DynamoDB is bad, then AWS is bad, right? And I don't believe AWS is bad, so I'm actually going to go say, and DynamoDB is, I think, is going to be my database of choice when developing microservices if I need to state in some way. So I wanted to use DynamoDB and Ruby for some level. So the 757RB project, this is the sort of contrived thing, the excuse I needed to use DynamoDB. I just wanted to make an API call with I think I used NetHTTP or Faraday, and I was like, I need to call some service with XML, so I have a reason to do XML. Apparently the future is now. XML API services are hard to find. Like, it's all JSON now. So I knew I wanted to use libxml. So I found this thing called PLOS. I think it's some scientific research paper thing. I have no idea what it is. But it had an XML interface, so I was joyed to find it. So I was like, I'll go ahead and use it with the Ruby app and see if I could, when you hit Dynamo, when you hit the Rails app, or I'm sorry, the Ruby app that I cooked up, if you hit this interface and you passed it a query, I would take the query param in the Lambda, I'd pass it down, and I would do a Faraday request. And then whatever I got back from that request, for no apparent reason at all, I would just stuff it in DynamoDB, just to say I was using DynamoDB, right? So there's no caching involved there, there's nothing fancy. I just wanted a reason to use libxml and to make an HTTP request and stuff it in DynamoDB. For no other reason, because I wanted pi. So if you crack open the project, you will see that, that bit of code in there and how I did that. The way that I started the project is Sam actually gives you a way to bootstrap or kick off a blank project. You know how you type in Rails new and it will give you a basically new Rails project. If you do sam init, it will give you a brand new Lambda project with a CloudFormation template, a directory structure, almost like if you did bundle gem, right? Like you can make a new Ruby gem and bundle will build the entire structure for you along with the gem spec and everything like that. So this is how I started the project. When you look at the Git history, this is where it started off. This is the first command I ran. I just committed everything on the first commit, said initial project, and then each pull request I made that changed it went off of this. I won't go into detail, but this is some of the stuff that I did in there. This is the bin build script. The main part of it is where I use sam build use container. But some of the interesting bits that I had to figure out how to work with Sam is that, like, I needed to, what was important for me is that if you built it, I needed to also let the local development server work. And what that meant is that if you look, say, on line 17 to 23, actually had to go into, so it will build it in the .aws sam build directory. So what I would do is I would, after the build script would run, I would copy the gems that it installed into the local root path, and then I would do another bundle install. And I don't know if you know this, but you can actually run a bundle install on Linux, copy that directory, run it again on your Mac, and you'll get a combined, like this bundle directory will work on both Linux and Mac. It'll actually put the .bundle in the .so files native for each platform next to it, and then when your platform loads the gems, it'll only load the extensions that you need. A little bit of a hack, but it's definitely wrong, but it works. It means that, right? You don't ship those bits to production, but it means that when you needed to look at your code, either through SAM server, that you can look at it under your platform specifically. Like, let's say if you wanted to run unit tests, where you're just basically kicking off a script and you were loading your own Ruby version. But if you needed to, you can actually kick up the Docker image that loads in on top and run the test under the Linux AMI, basically, that Sam was running under. So you had sort of the best of both worlds, which I think is important. Another thing I did, this is the bin server script. So one of the things that I found that is if you did a SAM build and you tried to start the local API server, it will prefer the working directory that it copied inside of the build directory. I didn't like that because then it means you kind of like you have the project that you see in your Sublime or Atom or whatever editor you're using, and it felt awkward to me to go to another directory to edit files and hit refresh in my browser. So, but I found if you just remove that directory, it'll use your local project file again just fine. Some of the patterns I came out with is like, so just good directory. So I found out, like, when you did a basic Ruby project, it makes an app directory, it makes a test directory like you would expect, like if you just wanted to run a test unit or something like that. It puts your app.rb script in the app directory, so everything was just basically in these two directories. It was really clean. So there is some, you don't have to follow that structure, but there was a basic directory structure that they set up for you. When I authored this Lambda, I basically just used small poros, which is just plain old Ruby objects. I had a coworker of mine on the Lambda project that I've been doing in Node for the past year when he first got into it. And he told me, he's like, Ken, when I come into this project, I feel like I just kind of have to learn how you've organized this stuff. And coming from a background where we have lots of Rails and Ruby apps at Custom Inc., you can move from one to the other, and it's easy for an engineer to go, okay, I know Rails, right? You may use RSpec here versus Minitest, right? But they're generally going to grok the pattern, and they're going to be able to leverage and move into one project from another. with Lambda, it's kind of like JavaScript's the Wild West anyway, but Lambda in JavaScript, it's more sort of Wild West. There really is no way you're going to organize your projects, right? And there's nothing set down, because eventually it's just all back to one function. And I thought I organized the project really well, but no matter how good I do it, it's still this little snowflake of a project that you have to go, well, did you use POJOs? Did you use POROs? Do you have your services here? How is it structured? And that was, I just used basic POROs. There's no other solution, right? If your function's small, then hopefully the cognitive load of understanding that project is low. But if it's bigger, then I definitely need some other structure. I learned how to do debug HTML, event, context, and environment. So when you look at my app.rb in this project, if you're new to Lambda, so I think I'll go back here, or what did we say? This was Lambda right here. So you get the event and the context. That's the only thing you get. In this event, both of these are two hashes, right? One's an object, but it acts just like a hash. And that event object is basically going to have like it's probably like a 30 property hash of just everything from like the path that came in, the query parameters, all that stuff that sort of triggered this Lambda. If your Lambda is triggered by an S3 event, right, it's going to have, that event object will be sort of germane to whatever sort of spawned your Lambda to trigger off on. But in my stuff, if you look at the app.rb that I did in this project, you'll see that, like I always wondered like what was in this object, what stuff was I going to use for it. So I actually put a simple debug method in so that if you set an environment variable, the entire Lambda would switch gears, and rather than do all the stuff that you asked it to do that was probably important for your business, it would just give you debug information. It would basically echo back to you the context or the event so that you can go, okay, that's what's coming in. Let me figure out how to use this object to move them around. So you'll see that in there as well. And I always put a debug mode inside of Lambdas. I make sure that that debug mode doesn't ship to production, but it's, whether you trigger it off a param or an environment variable, I always recommend doing that. And I did want to try to do mini test and Travis CI and Capybara stuff, but I never got there. So I put not really down out there. But but I did get to this. So apparently there's a gem out there. I never knew it. It's called AWS Record. And I would have thought that you would have used the SDKs that Amazon provided. But this thing is, there's the link for it at the bottom. This thing is badass, right? Like it actually wraps up your entire interactions with DynamoDB and like a really nice sort of like a PORO interface, right? You mix this behavior in, and I'll show you an example. So I wanted to use DynamoDB, and here's what it looked like inside my template.function. So basically these lines between, say, 44 and 55, it's CloudFormation, and it expressed for CloudFormation that, hey, when I deploy this stack, I want you to make a DynamoDB table for me. Now, fun fact, there used to be a thing that Amazon, I think it's deprecated, called Simple Table or SimpleDB. It is not the same thing. So SimpleDB, if you ever look up something in AWS services, SimpleDB is not the same thing as the syntactic sugar for type AWS serverless simple table. Simple table is basically just DynamoDB. And I didn't have to do anything. Like if I just gave it a table name, that would have been the only thing I'd had to give it. But in this case, I'm giving it a table name of the PLOS search. Line 51, there's a thing called intrinsic functions. So it's basically like meta programming inside of YAML, which is pretty interesting in case the stage name is actually an environment variable that's set further up. So if I was deploying this to production, the name of the DynamoDB table would be PLOS-search-production. And then I gave it a simple schema. I just basically said make a primary key with a name with an ID, and it's a string type. And this up here, this is the part of the YAML where it expresses that I'm deploying and making a function. It's got some things like, of course I'm going to be using the Ruby runtime, the memory size, and the timeout. But you have to, when your Lambda is running in production, there's a thing called the execution role. So your Lambda runs under this role, this IAM role. And if you need it to do other things and connect to other services, you have to give it permissions under that role to be able to access that. So think of that as like database credentials, right? Or like if this Lambda needed to talk to this S3 bucket, right? So what I'm doing here is basically you're saying this Lambda role will have policies, and I'm basically using, if you've never done IAM before, it's basically the permission system of AWS. And I'm basically saying here, give this Lambda this version and allow it to do anything, and the asterisk says anything in DynamoDB. Now you normally wouldn't give that. But if this Lambda owned this DynamoDB table, the asterisk at the end of the action there gives it full access to DynamoDB table. And then you get pretty expressive. Once you learn this language, you can pretty much do a lot of stuff in the cloud. And this is what my PORO looked like. I basically just mixed in AWS record. I set the table name again. I wrote a little PORO that does nothing but reflect on it's kind of like the Rails environment, but it's called a stage name in API Gateway. And then I just said, hey, make a simple column like an ID, a title, and an abstract. And whenever I did the XML search, I would just put it in DynamoDB. And there was this little thing here I kind of wanted. That is horrible in color. Oh my God, my other slide's gonna be bad. So this was one of the cool things is DynamoDB now has a pay-per-request model. So it's pretty much like you don't have to, oh yeah, it's better on that one. You don't have to provision it ahead of time. And in this case, I've used that table config in some of my setup scripts. So like if I were to check, another engineer were to check this project out, let's say you have an AWS account, and you were to clone this repo, and you were to run bin bootstrap and bin server. You would have this Lambda function running in like 0 time, and then you wouldn't even have to create the DynamoDB table. When this Ruby Lambda spins up, I actually call create at the handler, and it will just make this DynamoDB for you table lazily right when your script executes, if there's not one there already. Which I think is pretty badass. Like there's a lot of features. I actually want to find more uses for DynamoDB and just spend some time looking inside the AWS record gem and using it more.
Did you try RDS at all in terms of connecting to that? Because I fiddle with it. It's really a pain in the butt.
Yeah, there's a lot of articles out about. So here's the thing. So when your Lambda spins up, think of it as like your Rails app booting. And so there's what they call cold starts. So anything that needs to be sort of like in memory or cached for each request that comes to it has to be done outside the handler. So like that's going to be your requires, your instantiation of some sort of like database connections and stuff like that. And the bad thing about Lambda is that you get a handler for when the request comes in, but you don't really have a handler for when the request is done. So there's no way to do connection pooling in traditional database sense. But people do it, and I don't know, I haven't dived deep in yet, right? So I've kind of stayed away for it because technically DynamoDB is going to be HTTP based, right? So I do.
The rights management was, I couldn't get a connection, and the Dynamo, like you said, I think because it's API based.
Yeah.
Someone needs to make like an API for MySQL or
Right.
Postgres.
Well, they actually do now, don't they?
Well, so the trouble with RDS is that it's much more low level in terms of the way you set it up in CloudFormation.
Oh,
or
yeah.
even if you set it up in the console. You're actually, for the most part, going to be spinning up instances. You're going to be creating a VPC with private and public subnets.
Mhm.
You have to make sure
Bingo.
you have the routing table set up correctly so your different subnets can talk to each other. And I'm going to just guess that probably had a network problem. And it's incredibly easy
Right.
to have a network problem because it's very intricate.
It's
Yeah.
really hard to figure out what's going
Yeah.
on.
Whereas Dynamo, it's one command, and you've got a Dynamo table, and IAM controls access to it, and you're done. And
Yes.
that's why it's great.
So thank you for mentioning that. One of the things I didn't mention about CloudFormation is that not only in one CloudFormation file can you express infrastructure that you need to create, and their main sections of it would be things like parameters, like input parameters, options and toggles, variables, etc. Another would be like the resources, the stuff that you need to create. Another section could be like mappings, which is sort of like a top-level hash of data lookups, right? So if I'm deploying this CloudFormation stack, say in US East 1, I may want to use this AMI version of an EC2 instance versus another. But the cool thing about CloudFormation is that there is an output section, right? So that you can say, okay, this CloudFormation will create these things, and then it will output these variables. And then you can make another CloudFormation template that inputs those. So like if you were making an RDS instance from infrastructure as code, you would create the DB parameter group in the RDS instance in one, output it, and then you would tell the Lambda template, right, to input some connection stuff for it or some permissions for it in some way, right? But then low level wise, when your Lambda runs, let's say your Lambda is incredibly popular and it takes 100 or 1,000 requests a second, right? And AWS is like, okay, this Lambda's hot. Let's spin up more of them for you, right? Then as you spin up more, you need to create routes to the database through the VPC so you could quickly chew through the IP addresses that you have available in the VPC. And that's another problem, right? So databases in Lambda, not easy right yet. But supposedly I hear that they might be addressing that with cold starts, but I've stayed far away from it. if it's not DynamoDB.
So with Lambdas, some of the time you're going to be reusing the same container instance that's running your Lambda. There are no guarantees made ever.
Yeah.
But especially if you're doing a large number of requests, you may spend a significant number of seconds reusing the same container instance. And so if you want to try and cache database connections, you can attempt to do that. You can use global variables, you can write to disk, and you can try and cache things, whether it's data or connections and so on,
right.
Within that Lambda, and you may get the cache.
So part of the success of my career is not doing stuff like that. Right? So it's like, I'll tend to do the very simple first versus the hard stuff. So I definitely recommend, if you're new to Lambda, stay away from databases and Postgres. Like you said, I'll talk about Jets for a little bit. They do say that you can do that stuff, but it is a problem field. Use DynamoDB. Moving on, let's see. We did the simple table defaults. Again, I wanted to remind everybody that my little dive into Ruby and Lambda was basically, it's all in this repo. I'll share out these slides afterwards, or in the DC Tech Slack room, and you can go dig that apart and crack it open and do something that looks like more or less not Hello World, that's actually doing something, and look for that as sort of inspiration for to build off of and get involved with it. Rails and Lambda. This is the fun stuff. So I think I'll go through these really quickly. I don't know if we have any deadlines. So there's this thing called Jets. And when I did some initial research about how to run Rails and Lambda, we have microservices at Custom Inc. that don't have databases. They don't do anything. They're just small Rails apps that just do these things. And I think they would make excellent candidates to move to Lambda and off of EC2. There's also some things I've been doing with our marketing department on spinning up new ideas for processing images and doing some cool marketing things. I used to be a marketer. I used to be a graphic artist before I was a programmer, and I really want to do these good ideas for them, but I'm like, I don't want to bother our web ops department and spin up EC2 instances for things that may or not prove value. So I'm going to do these in Rails, or I think they're compatible with Rails, and I really just want a way to get a Rails app into Lambda for a lot of reasons. So I looked at this project. It's called Jets. It will supposedly, I've done it, it will help you get a Rails app, an existing Rails app, into Lambda. And it does a lot of stuff. Like this is a screenshot of my AWS account on the CloudFormation stacks that it creates. And you can see there's one down there called Demo Jets. And Demo Jets uses what's called a nested CloudFormation stack methodology. And it created 1, 2, 3, 4 other CloudFormation stacks. And it basically got my Rails app, or a basic Hello World app, into AWS Lambda. But it is complicated. Like, it is really complicated. It's doing some amazing stuff. And it ends up, if you dig around your AWS account, you'll like find all these things all over the place. And it's, if you're in a company like mine where they kind of like to go, where it's a big company and there's already a lot of other stuff in your AWS account, and there's maybe some trepidation to adding like a shotgun blast of just more stuff. I don't want to call it garbage, right? Because other engineers put a lot of work into this, and I'm sure it's a great project. If you feel like Jets is for you, that's fine. Please do use it. I don't want to use it because, I think a lot of my success in my career is not doing complicated stuff. Partially because, I don't like complicated. I would rather spend more time engineering simplicity. But I really wanted to understand from an engineering perspective what it would take to get Rails on Lambda. What is the minimum amount of work to get Rails on Lambda? And can I build from there, right? And avoid all this other stuff. I've written many gems and Ruby gems, and I've done a couple of large open source projects, and I know, like if I was this guy, or it's this guy, I would just be dying for my, I can imagine he'll wake up one day and he'll see 5 pull requests, and because he's taken so much work on how to get Rails out into Lambda, you're pigeonholed into this way of doing it. And if you need to do something that's a little bit off the beaten path, you're going to have to go learn all this work he's done, and then try to make a pull request or some config or some toggle that'll let you do this thing that's just perfectly reasonable, and it'll be hard, right? And I would rather have a happy path to Lambda, so I have avoided this. But if it's for you, it's for you, and I'm not trashing him. He's probably a great engineer. He's definitely smarter than I am, because I couldn't do all this stuff. So here's my story on how I got to Rails on Lambda. First things first, I made a new, I use RB environment here. I made a new Rails app, just a very simple one. And again, I'm going to share this code later on in some blog articles. And basically I said, let's skip active record, let's skip action nailer, I'll skip the Rails 5 active storage, I'll skip action cable, I'll skip Spring, CoffeeScript's out. I used to love CoffeeScript, but I'm now on full-on Node and ES6 now. TurboLinks, I love TurboLinks, but I skipped it. That's another talk. And Bootsnap is basically like the modern Spring. So this is basically mimics one of our smaller microservices that's doing nothing at Custom Ink that does some image processing that I wanted to mirror. And it's a Rails app. It doesn't have a database and it doesn't have these other mailer things, but that's fine. So now I'm like looking at the Lambda handler. I'm like, okay, now how am I going to wire this Rails app to this Lambda handler, right? How do I get the HTTP status code and stuff done? So I cracked open Jets and I tried to look at what they were doing. And I thought a little bit, and I don't know if everybody here, how many people have done Rails here? Yes, right. So we've all typed Rails console, right? And I don't know, this is an often feature that maybe a lot of people don't use in the Rails console, but you can do, you can use your app from the command line. Like you can send it a GET request to the root and you can look at the response. You can basically deal with your app in the Rails console. And if you dig around your project directory a little bit, there's this one file at the root of it called config.ru. And you look at it and you go, well, wait a minute, this is the main interface for how, like, if you spin up like Rails server or Puma and stuff like that, this is how your Rails app responds under HTTP. And having been around the block for a while, I knew that this was basically rack, right? So rack is actually what's processing that config.ru. A Rails application is essentially a rack application. It has a top-level interface. And if it can be instantiated in the Rails console for you, there's basically probably a way that you can build it through code. And all rack things, I mean, look at this, right? So for a Lambda handler for HTTP, status code, headers, body. A rack app, status code, headers, body, right? That's perfect. I don't know if they got together. I guess it's just it's HTTP. It's perfect. I didn't know it was that easy, right? So like, I've never really done I've done some rack middleware before, but I kind of looked at this stuff and I was like, okay, there's got to be a way for wiring this up. And if you, I'll share the code out again later on. And if you look at it, it's basically this. The main app.rb for my Lambda will require the config application that's in your Rails project. It will require the environment. And then I use, there's a lot of ways I could have done this. And I did a couple failed attempts that have certain value in some situations that I'd like to blog more about. But I'm basically using the rack DSL called the builder. And then I'm running the Rails application inside of it. I'm calling toApp, and that returns an instance of my Rails app as a rack app. And then all you got to do is, let's imagine, I'm not going to show it, but imagine this method that I make further down in the private thing called lambda to rack. You pass it the event and the context that comes in, and then it just returns what rack does, right? So basically it does call. So it takes app and it does call, and it will convert the API gateway event and context that is sent to your Lambda, and it will convert one hash into basically another hash. That's really what it does. It's basically taken, well, two hashes, and then it makes one hash that basically looks like an HTTP rack event, and you just send it to your app, and it works. Like it works. So I sent, if everybody here's on Slack, I sent a link out in the Arlington Slack channel, and this is basically, my app did two things, right? It made an index file, and I put a couple links on top of it just to make sure that I can navigate around and hit different views. And on the left is me working in local development, and on the right is when I shipped it and did bin deploy and used the same package and same deploy and shipped it up to AWS. It freaking worked. Like, I can't tell you, like that's, so, and that's all, but no, it's not, right? Like, there was way more stuff, and I'm actually, I will turn this into a blog series, but there's really cool things that I learned while doing this. So a couple of things that I'll talk a little bit more about in the blog articles is that Docker for Mac kind of sucks, right? So I didn't know this. I use Docker a lot, but there's this one line. Do you remember this line here I showed you? You see require config application? When I spun up AWS SAM and it mounted the Linux Docker image and it connected the volumes of my local directory in my editor with the volume under the Linux container, that one line of code, I ran it with benchmark.realtime, took about 45, 50 seconds on Docker. Right, so I spent like 2 days on this. I was like, okay, SAM sucks, right? Like Lambda sucks, right? And I shipped it up to production and I was like, oh, it works fine, it's there. And then I eventually sort of stepped slowly back. I was like, maybe it's the Python code that Sam's using, maybe something's happening, maybe like, but eventually I found out there's this long-standing Docker bug on Mac where if you mount volumes, there's this thing called OSFX, which is a Docker daemon, and shared volumes there's a lot of overhead. Docker will do a lot of work to make sure that if you change a file on your Mac, that file on the Docker image is reflected. And apparently there's a lot of I/O involved in doing that, and it's incredibly unperformant. Now they have workarounds, but I literally had to, I've never done Python before, and I know that AWS SAM is written in Python, so I called up one of our data engineers on Slack. I'm like, dude, you got to pair program with me. You got to teach me enough, like, you know, I'm so Aaron Patterson, I'm a puts debugger. I don't use like fancy debuggers and steps. I'll just raise hell in the middle of anything, right? Shane?
Yeah. Do you think it's time for all developers to use a Linux laptop instead of Mac? It's cheaper, more like with server and your desktop
Does it run Keynote?
on the same.
Which that would be a feature that it doesn't have Keynote.
So I have all my photos,
Right.
It just works. Why not?
but wait a minute, but my life also works on Mac, which is more important.
Get rid of the life.
Spin up a VM.
Right. Well, right, so it is a good point. I actually do think there is a future where like maybe we'll all be programming in Cloud 9 and everything we're doing is on EC2 instances or stuff like that. I just don't know if we're there yet, right? I'm very intimate with my computer. I like to work on it. I like it to do my text messages and my other things and stuff like that. So I'm not ready to make that jump. But I did waste 2 days and I did find out. It is amazing to me. I mean, Docker's been out on Mac for a long time. I didn't know this bug existed. I certainly didn't see it in my Node project, and that weirded me out, like why I didn't notice it. Because we all know leftpad and my Node modules directory for my project had to be more than just the Rails gem directory. I can't imagine. I don't know. I'll dig into it. But basically, I changed one line of Python. There's a Docker variable that you can pass. They actually solve this problem, and they allow it to be, you can declare the volume share to be cached or delegated. So they'll stop all that necessary I/O. And it turned that one require from 40 seconds to 5 seconds. That's bad, right? 5 seconds is still really bad for a require that should only take maybe 100 milliseconds at best. But that's my pain. I'm sharing it with you. I feel better, right? Like I've let go of it. That's the reason I came here today. There's 3 days of my life gone. Another that I thought was really interesting is logging. So like you can't write to the file system on Lambda, but Rails wants to log, right? There's the development.log, production.log. And I was so happy to find this. I did some digging. Like I've done 2 layers of logging hacks. One is in the little library that I wrote that I think I'm going to put together as a gem. It'll basically open up the logger thing, and anytime you try to build a new logger, it'll automatically redirect the output to standard out, right? And I load that early on so that all the other requires early on are just forced to standard out. But there's also an environment variable that I set in my library too. I guess this is a good 12-factor practice that Rails sort of adopted, that logging should be the standard out for, I guess, things like Heroku and stuff like that. And it certainly helped out on Lambda. Keeping package size down. There's some little tricks I did where I felt like when I did the build, like it'll build the vendor gems. And if anybody here has ever looked at their vendor gems, there's a directory called cache, and it's basically a gzip version of all the gems that you just installed, just sitting there for the hell of it. That actually saved me about 40%, because when you make a package, when you package up all your code and you ship it to S3 and deploy it to your Lambda, that package has to be 50 megabytes tops. It is 250 megabytes uncompressed. That's your limit for your code on Lambda. And Rails is kind of big and stuff like that, so I was able, my package is still only about 17 megabytes for my Rails app. I still got lots of headroom to go. But I was able to get it from 35 to 17 with just that one little line of code by deleting the cache. And then invoke URL. So when your Lambda is shipped to production, by default you have this crazy URL that AWS gives you, and it's called the invoke URL, and it has some like crazy sort of physical digest ID, with AWS execute with the region, and then like a slash at the end of it that denotes what's called the API gateway stage. Think of that as your Rails environment, right? Production, dev, test. Now, when you do Rails apps, right, like it's only supposed to know about, it shouldn't know about the production. So I did some sweet hacks with passing parameters from API gateway as a header. I transitioned that in my event to rack environment. I pass a header down to the Rails app that lets it know it's running under API gateway, and then I change the default URL options. So like this is what I had to do inside of my route file. Like I've always wanted to use some of the advanced features that Rails gives you for doing routes. So basically the paren there means that that's a path parameter that's optional. And I called it the API gateway stage. And then in my Rails application controller, through a mixin, I'll look to see if that magic header is there. And then I'll set a default URL parameter, which we probably all used that hack method before, and it sets it, and it works great. So that means if you're using Lambda with a Rails app that has links, and you're using the default invoke URL versus a custom domain name mapped on top of it, which sort of strips all that away through CloudFront. A lot of words, but I definitely learned it. Let's see. So coming soon, so the things I'm going to work up next, after I obviously got it working, yay, is I'm going to finish up the rack integration. I'm probably going to put it into a gem. That's going to be some sort of like very small gem that you can install in your Rails app. I'm going to do some more testing around it. Like for instance, I haven't tested session or cookies or these other things that are coming through in the headers, but I want to. I want to write a little bit of bash script so that when you build this and you ship to production, I'll make a CloudFormation template that will create an S3 bucket that has events hooked up so that it'll automatically have long TTLs for cache expiry. So basically, your assets will get precompiled, put into an S3 bucket. I'll change the Rails asset host. So basically, all your assets will come from the bucket for a CDN source. Badass, right? Like so, no precompile on the production servers anymore. I got to do some work around the encrypted session secret via AWS System Manager. There's an environment variable in Rails called session secret. I think it's called session secret. Yeah, and that's basically helps the digest for your encrypted cookies and stuff like that. And I just hacked it. I threw it at the top of the script, but I want to use all the AWS services I can to build out my resume. And then I do, it was really hard to use what we do in development, like you can have groups inside of your gem file. I couldn't deal with those because of the way that you're building, you need to run stuff, so I want to figure out a better way to handle dev and test groups so that I'm not putting development or test gems in the production bundle that I've sent it off. Almost done. This is a screenshot of what the standard out logging looks like in CloudWatch. CloudWatch is basically where all the logs aggregate inside of AWS. Rails has this thing called tag logging, and it basically takes a UUID of the request. And how many people here have used New Relic? And if you ever use New Relic with services and it's able to go from, hey, your New Relic hit this app, but it made a request to this app, and you can go from one New Relic instance to the other, it's basically headers, right, in the request. It'll copy one header from the original request, it'll force it into like NetHTTP and spin it off because New Relic basically monkey patches all Ruby, right, and it will take that header and pass it down. So what I want to basically do is learn the way that when the request comes in, I'll take that request ID and I'll pass it to the Rails tag logging so that you could follow a logical log stream if you needed to. Probably nobody will ever use it, but it seemed like a neat thing to do. And then the other thing is I wanted to use Lambda layers, which is basically a way to declare reusable portions. Lambda layers, in its simplest form, just think of it as code that you can put in the op directory and you can compose those. They go against your main file size. So with your package uncompressed and all Lambda layers, you're still at 250 megabytes max file size. And I knew this because I got certified and I had to answer that question on an exam. And that's about it. So like, this is a group sport. I do like programming in the public, so at some point when I write these articles and stuff like that, I will have this repo up on a public custom ink repo, and I'll share it, and I'll do pull requests, and if other people feel like helping out or contributing to it, that would be pretty cool. And then I'll just end this with a couple announcements. So I have a Ruby group too from the Hampton Roads area. Next week, a friend of mine named Eric Hayes, I think he used to work with Aaron Patterson at Red Hat, but now he's in my podunk little town, and he's going to do a talk for us next week on turbolinks and stimulus.js. I love turbolinks. I love not writing lots of JavaScript single-page applications because it's way easier. And Eric has this talk he submitted for RailsConf, but got rejected. So he's like, well, let's just give it to the group. But Colleen, another member of our group, part of the Moms Who Can Code initiative, her talk did get accepted to RailsConf. Yay! And she's agreed to do her talk for our Ruby group same month as RailsConf, but in a more little intimate session. And she's going to talk a little bit about how she took one of her large contract apps and moved it away from carrier wave to active storage. And I think, and again, just reminding everybody, I'm on these Slack channels. I will follow up with like repos and some blog articles and stuff like that. This is actually only the start of it, and that's it. Cool. Thanks. And you-
With the layers, when I was at the AWS conference, and I asked the guy who wrote the Ruby implementation about the layers.
Yeah.
And whether or not you'd be able to put your gem, vendor directory basically in a layer that way. Every time.
You can. There is, yeah. If you output gem env or something like that to your Rails app, and you will see that directory. There's a vendor directory in the op directory that's in like when you do requires in Ruby. There's a lookup path. I forget if it's just a load path, and the op directory is in it. So you definitely can.
And if you write to that, will it perpetuate? In other words, if you have it.
No, I think that only the layer can write to it for some reason.
So how do you prep it before you deploy it so that it has all of your gems compiled for Linux, ready to go, so that you just mount it in there and you don't have to?
I would imagine you'd use the Docker image, and at the end of the day, the layer is just a gzip file that has to have a directory structure of /opt. So they'll basically, in the directions I read, it's basically a merge, right? So let's say you have two layers that use opt foo bar, right? The second layer that comes in will overwrite that one. So you kind of have to be a little bit smart about knowing the directory structure within the opt directory that the layers use. And there's actually a website called Awesome Layers. It's a GitHub repo that started that shares out all the layers that different people are sharing right now. So there may be one for Ruby and image management. If there's not, I'm certainly going to contribute to that project.
So I have good news for you. If you use SAM, then SAM can handle layers as well.
Yeah, it does it for you automatically.
So in the same way that you specify a relative code path for your function code, then SAM will take care of gzipping it, uploading it to S3, and emitting a new template with the reference to the S3 object. It does the same thing for the layers as well.
And they did that on the day it was released. That was
Yeah.
amazing. It reinvented it. As soon as they said it, like I saw it merged right into the SAM repo.
So it just basically, it just works. Just don't try and do nested stacks.
But you can basically then, it'll detect whether or not your gems have changed at all, and therefore not update that.
It'll basically always upload it. It'll because it uses a unique object ID. It's
Mhm.
always just going to create a new object in S3, but S3 storage is effectively free, and so it'll just create a new Lambda each time.
But at least it'll keep your bundle smaller.
And
Yeah.
so the way, sorry, I don't mean Lambda, I meant layers. So the way layers work is they actually, each time, they're immutable, but each time you create a new one, it updates, it increments the version number on the layer. So a layer name has like blah, 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 :1, :2, :3 as a version on it. And it'll keep old layers behind, and you can eventually go back and read them.
Yeah, I don't think you can mutate the directory structure within the development cycle, where you'll have to have another thing that creates the layer, and then it's just merged in and stuff.
So you'd have to build the Rails process first and then create the layer.
Yeah. But like, I mean, I firmly believe that Lambda is just like this technology that's sort of like this, it's this mind shift unlocked to where it's like, I'm getting into ops. I'm getting into like, not necessarily the wires and boxes. I remember back in the day when I wanted to keep my job, I learned how to do router configuration, right? And not Photoshop for some point, but like it's fun to get into this. And I find it sort of an equalizer of getting people involved, right? Like, so the barrier is being lowered for anybody to contribute into the ops stack and start getting code into production and stuff like that. And I think nothing but good can come out of that. And get more people sort of into that sort of like, that mixture of things where you normally have just like a bunch of nerds in a room that say, oh, you can't have this EC2 box, or I don't know. I'm gonna ship it to Lambda.
But do you think this 5 minutes maximum runtime on the Lambda is a factor to?
I think it's 15 now.
It's not 15 minutes?
It's 15 now.
Oh, that's much better.
Don't tell me what you're doing. I guess, but I've heard some people have been using Lambda now that went up to 15 minutes, and they've been parallelizing machine learning models on it now too, which I guess is valid. But I read it.
Some of other, when you mean because you're sharing it with someone else, it's paralyzing the other people.
Yeah, or like I've traditionally heard that you have to use EC2 to do machine learning models, right? Because you kind of have to let one computer work on it for a long time. But I read a blog article where people are doing sort of full text machine learning on publisher websites, and they figured out a way to do different types of learning on models that are shared across Lambda instances at scale that turn sort of the model training from like, many hours to like a few minutes now.
Oh, I thought you were saying it was blocking other people using Lambda while they.
No, yeah.
So that's-
Cool, thank you guys so much for coming out. That's awesome. Thank you for letting me speak.